She was refilling his coffee when he said it. Not quietly. Not the way a man says something embarrassing and then wishes he could take it back. He said it the way men say things when they are performing for an audience, and the audience is laughing, which means the cruelty has a rhythm and a timing, and it arrives clean, like a punchline that has been tested before. He said it with one hand loose around his crystal tumbler, and his chair tilted back, and his colleagues all around him at the long conference table. 6 of them, 3 in suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And he looked at the woman pouring his coffee and he said, "Careful, sweetheart. Don't spill it. That's probably the most important thing you'll do all day." 2 of them laughed. One looked at the table. The others watched the way people watch a thing they know is wrong but have decided in advance is not their problem. The woman holding the coffee pot did not spill a drop. Her hand was perfectly steady. She set the pot down on the warming plate beside the credenza, and she straightened, and she looked at him. Not at the table, not at the floor, not at some point past his left ear where a person looks when they are absorbing a blow they cannot afford to answer. She looked directly at him, and she said, "Of course, Mr. Calder." Her name was Frances Okafor. She had been working as a catering assistant on the executive floor of Meridian Capital Group for 11 months. She was 41 years old, and she wore her uniform pressed every single day. And she moved through the 32nd floor of that building with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that her presence was supposed to be invisible, and who had made a private peace with that, and who was going to be, in approximately 16 days, the most visible person in the entire company. But Edward Calder did not know that yet. Edward Calder was 48 years old, Senior Vice President of Strategic Development, and he had occupied the 32nd floor of Meridian Capital Group for 7 years, with the confidence of a man who had decided very early that certain rooms belonged to him by a logic he could not be asked to explain. He was not unintelligent. He was not without skill. He understood markets the way some men understand music, instinctively and with genuine pleasure, and the company had grown considerably under his division's guidance, and he knew that, and he had allowed knowing it to become the lens through which he saw everything else. His suits were excellent. His handshake was firm. He treated people whose names appeared on organizational charts above a certain line with warmth and consideration, and a real attentiveness that they all found impressive. And he treated people whose names did not appear on any chart at all as though they were part of the furniture, noticed when absent, invisible when present, never introduced, never thanked by name. The woman who cleaned his office every morning had worked there for 2 years. He did not know her name. The man who brought the mail trolley past his door every afternoon had done so for 4 years. Edward Calder had never once looked up. Frances Okafor had been pouring his coffee for 11 months. He called her sweetheart. That was the thing about Edward Calder. He was not a monster in the way that would make the story simple. He was something more ordinary, and in some ways more difficult to name. A man who had arranged the world inside his own mind so that certain people existed in it, and others simply did not, and who had never been given a reason to question that arrangement. Not yet. The morning he said it, the sweetheart morning, the coffee morning, Frances went back to the service kitchen on 32, and she set the warming pot on the counter, and she stood very still for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, with her hands flat on the stainless steel surface. Miriam Park, who managed the executive catering team, and who had been doing so for 9 years, and who had heard a great many things said in a great many tones in that building, watched her from across the kitchen. Miriam said, "He's not worth it." Frances said, very quietly, "I know he's not." Miriam said, 3 more weeks. Frances looked up. A small thing crossed her face. Not quite a smile. Not quite the opposite of one. She said, 2.5. What Miriam Park knew, and Edward Calder did not, was that Francis Okafor had a first-class degree in finance from the University of Edinburgh, a master's in corporate restructuring from the London School of Economics, and 11 years of experience inside two of the most technically demanding investment environments in the country, the last three of which she had spent as a quiet, non-public consultant to the board of Meridian Capital Group's parent company, not the subsidiary, not the branch, not the 32nd floor, the parent company, the one whose name appeared above Meridian's on the letterhead that no one on the 32nd floor had ever needed to think about very carefully. She had come to the executive floor 11 months ago at the specific request of that board. Not to be visible, to watch, to understand the internal culture of the division from inside it, from the position that showed you the most, because it showed you everything the division chose not to see. She had been the woman pouring the coffee, because pouring the coffee put her in every significant room on 32 without a badge, without a scheduled appearance, without an agenda item or a courtesy introduction from the CEO's office. She was the help, and the help, in buildings like this one, moved through rooms like water, through a house, everywhere, unnoticed, recording everything. She had been filling her notebook for 11 months. The notebook was not metaphorical. It was an actual notebook, navy blue, A5, kept in her bag and written in every evening after her shift. It contained observations, specific incidents, direct quotations, dates and times, names and roles. It contained the morning two members of Edward's team had discussed a client portfolio adjustment in the corridor outside the kitchen without lowering their voices, because they were discussing it in front of a catering assistant, which meant they were discussing it in front of no one. It contained the afternoon Sam Birch had come into the kitchen to cry quietly into a paper towel after a dressing down so public that 3 other staff had heard it through the closed conference room door and said nothing. It contained 11 months of the 32nd floor behaving exactly as it behaved when it believed itself unobserved, which was differently from how it behaved when anyone worth watching was present. That notebook was going to inform the most significant internal restructuring in Meridian Capital Group's 14-year history. But first, Frances Okafor had to get through 2.5 more weeks of Edward Calder's coffee. She did. She got through them the way she had gotten through the 11 months, with her hand steady and her spine straight, and her expression giving away exactly nothing. She watched him perform for his team, and watched his team reflect his performance back at him, and watched the whole machine run on the fuel of his approval. And she wrote it all down in the Navy notebook every evening, and she set the pot on the warming plate. And she said, of course, Mr. Calder. And she went back to the kitchen. There is a particular kind of watching that is different from observation. Observation collects information. What Frances did was something older and more patient than that. She absorbed the culture of the 32nd floor the way a surface absorbs water, until she understood not just what people did, but why, and not just why in the professional sense of stated reasons and policy rationale, but why in the human sense of what people needed and what they feared and what they had stopped expecting because expecting it had become too expensive. She understood why the junior staff ate lunch at their desks, not because they were busy, but because the lunchroom had a particular social architecture that made it uncomfortable to use when certain people were in it. She understood why 3 members of Edward's team had a habit of checking his diary before they sent internal communications, timing their most vulnerable questions for windows when he was in external meetings, and therefore less likely to encounter their work while in a demonstrating authority mood. She understood why the woman who ran the stationery room kept a private log of supplies that had been removed from the communal store by people with senior passes, because the alternative was to raise a discrepancy report and have it go to the department head, which was Edward Calder, which was a thing nobody on 32 did lightly. These were not dramatic things. They were the ordinary texture of a floor that had organized itself around one person's personality over 7 years, the way a river bends around a fixed rock, not because the rock demands it, but because that is what rivers do, and after long enough it looks like the natural shape of the ground. Frances had 11 months of the natural shape of the ground in her notebook. It was more than enough. On the last day of the second week, Edward Calder held what he called a strategy alignment session in the main conference room, which meant the long table and all the chairs filled, and the glass walls and the city visible behind him, which he liked. Because the city visible behind a man at the head of a long table is a particular kind of theater, and Edward Calder had never been indifferent to theater. Frances poured the water. She poured the coffee. She arranged the pastry tray and stepped back to the side of the room, and she stood there while Edward opened the meeting, and while he went through 3 slides on projected revenue, and while he turned to the junior analyst, Sam Birch, 26 years old, very good at his job, visibly exhausted in the way of someone who has been working extraordinary hours for ordinary acknowledgement, and said, "In front of the full table, Sam, walk us through the Callaway numbers. And try to make it coherent this time." 2 people smiled. Sam's jaw tightened by a fraction and then released. He opened his laptop and began speaking in the careful, pre-edited voice of someone who has learned to subtract 50% of what they actually think before they start talking, and the analysis that came out of that subtraction was fine, technically correct, properly structured, professionally delivered, and it was not the analysis Sam Birch had written. Frances had read the original. The original was genuinely excellent, the kind of work that would make the room sit up if the room were the kind of room that sat up for things, which this room had not been for a long time. Frances looked at Sam Birch and felt something she had been keeping very professional and very contained for 11 months make one small, precise movement toward the surface. She set down the water jug. She was already looking at the door. The following Monday, at 9 o'clock in the morning, Frances Okafor walked into the 32nd floor of Meridian Capital Group through the main elevator bank for the first time in 11 months without a catering uniform. She wore a dark charcoal suit, tailored precisely, with a white shirt and no jewelry except small gold studs at her ears. Her hair was pulled back. She was carrying a briefcase and a coffee, her own, from the independent place on the corner of the street below, not from the service kitchen. Miriam Park, who had come in early specifically to be in the lobby when this happened, watched her cross the marble floor and felt an emotion so complete and satisfying she couldn't quite locate a name for it. The receptionist on 32 looked up. She had seen Frances Okafor walk past this desk every morning for 11 months, carrying warming pots and pastry trays. Her expression went through 3 transitions in approximately 2 seconds. Frances said, "Good morning. Please let Mr. Calder's assistant know that the 9:15 with the executive team will begin in the main conference room. I'll need the full room, all department heads, Mr. Calder's team, and please ensure Sam Birch is included specifically. His contribution will be central to this morning." The receptionist said, "I'm sorry." "And you are," Frances said. Frances Okafor, Director of Divisional Restructuring, appointed by the Meridian Group Parent Board, effective today. Mr. Calder's office should have received the formal notification last Thursday. If they didn't action it, that's useful information too. She walked past the reception desk toward the conference room without waiting for a response, because the response was a formality, and Frances Okafor had not come to the 32nd floor this morning to be processed by a formality. The notification had in fact been sent last Thursday. Edward Calder's assistant, a meticulous woman named June, who had privately noted the notification's arrival and privately wondered what it meant, had placed it in Edward's urgent correspondence folder, where it had sat unread for 72 hours because Edward Calder treated his urgent correspondence folder the way he treated most things that arrived from above his level of the organization, with the comfortable assumption that it would turn out to be something that required his approval and would therefore enhance, rather than complicate, his morning. He walked into the main conference room at 9:16, 1 minute late. In the particular way he arrived at things he had decided in advance were his to control. His full team was already there. Sam Birch was there, in the specific chair toward the end of the table where junior staff typically arranged themselves. 3 department heads were there. And at the head of the table, his seat, the seat with the city behind it, there was a woman in a charcoal suit with a navy notebook open in front of her and a pen in her hand and an expression of absolute composure. He stopped walking. The woman looked up at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at him 11 months ago, across the distance of a conference table, from the other side of that distance, with a direct steadiness that did not ask permission and did not require a response. She said, "Good morning, Mr. Calder. Please take a seat. We'll begin in a moment." The silence that followed lasted only 5 seconds. It felt like a great deal longer. Edward Calder said, "I'm sorry." "Who exactly?" Frances said. "Frances Okafor. You've had my name since Thursday. I'll give you a moment." She did not say it unkindly. She said it the way a person says something that is simply true and does not require embellishment. She turned a page in the Navy notebook, and the sound of that page turning in the quiet room was somehow the loudest thing in it. Edward Calder sat down. Not in his usual chair, that chair was taken, but in the chair to the right of the head of the table, which was where the second most senior person in the room typically sat, and which was where he was now. He sat in it carefully, with the specific care of a man who has just understood something but has not yet finished understanding it, and whose body is operating slightly ahead of his mind. Frances opened the meeting. She spoke for 11 minutes. Without notes, because the notes were in her head and had been there for 11 months. She outlined the restructuring framework. She named the divisions that were performing and the ones that were not. She named the specific practices in this department, on this floor, over the past 14 months that had produced a measurable decline in junior staff retention and a measurable increase in the kind of internal friction that costs a company money in ways that don't show up cleanly in a quarterly report, but show up very clearly, eventually, in the ones that follow. She did not name names. She did not need to. The people in the room who knew which names belonged to which practices were making that connection entirely on their own. Then, she turned to Sam Birch. She said, "Sam, I've read your Callaway analysis, all 3 versions, the one you submitted, the one you were asked to revise, and the original draft that you didn't submit because you were advised it was too detailed for the room. I'd like you to walk us through the original. Take as long as you need. This room is interested." Sam Birch looked at her for a moment with the expression of a person who has been told that a door they had stopped expecting to open has just opened. He said, "The original draft?" Frances said, "The one you actually wrote." Yes. Sam straightened in his chair. He opened his laptop. He began to speak, and the quality of the speaking was immediately different from what the room had heard from him before, not because he had changed, but because the permission had. And the difference between a person with permission and a person without it is the difference between a window that is open and one that is not. Across the table, Edward Calder watched all of this happen with the expression of a man standing in a room where the floor plan he memorized no longer applies. After the meeting, he waited. The room cleared around him, the department heads, Sam, the others, all of them carrying the particular energy of people who have been in a room where something real has happened and are still processing the shape of it. Frances closed her notebook and stacked her papers, and was preparing to leave when Edward spoke. He said, "Mrs. Okafor." She looked at him. He said, "I owe you an apology." He said it flatly, without ceremony, like a man who has decided the only remaining option is to be direct and has committed to it. He was not performing. The audience was gone. There was only the room and the table and the woman standing at the head of it with her briefcase in her hand, looking at him with an attention that was not warm and was not cold, but was utterly, completely present. He said, "The things I said, the way I—" He stopped. He tried again. "I had no idea who you were." Frances said, "I know." He said, "If I had known," she said quietly. "That's the part that matters, Miss Calder. The if I had known. Because the things you said them to a person. The title doesn't change that. The uniform doesn't change it. Whether I had letters after my name or not, you spoke to a human being the way you wouldn't speak to someone you considered worth your full attention. And that is the thing I'd like you to sit with, if you're genuinely asking me to accept an apology. Not I'm sorry I didn't know who you were. Something more honest than that." The silence after that was different from the silence when he had walked in. That one had been the silence of shock. This one was the silence of a man actually listening. He said, after a long moment, "I'm sorry I spoke to you the way I did. I'm sorry I speak to people the way I do. I don't think I knew how much of it I was doing." Frances looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "That second part might be the most useful thing you've said in this building in a long time. I'd suggest you hold on to it." She picked up her briefcase. She said, "Thursday, 9 o'clock. My agenda will be with you by tomorrow afternoon. There's a significant amount of work to do here, and I would find it genuinely useful to have your expertise on the strategic side applied to the restructuring. You're very good at what you do, Mr. Calder. That's not the issue. The issue is everything that happens alongside it." She left. He remained at the table in the empty room with the city visible behind the chair that was no longer his, and he sat there for a long time, longer than he would have admitted if anyone had asked. The room that had always been his room, the room where he had run his meetings and delivered his judgments and organized the 32nd floor around the gravitational certainty of his authority, was just a room now, a room with glass walls and a long table and a city behind it that did not know or care whose chair was at its head. He thought about the coffee morning. He did not want to think about it, but it came to him anyway. The specific detail of it, his hand around the tumbler, the two colleagues laughing, the word sweetheart delivered with the ease of a man who has said it 100 times to 100 people who had no power to answer it, and the woman's hand, perfectly steady, not spilling a single drop, setting the pot down and looking at him directly, and saying, of course, "Mr. Calder," which he had heard at the time as compliance, and which he understood now was something altogether different. She had known. She had known for 11 months exactly what she was watching and exactly how it would end, and she had carried that knowledge through every morning with that steady hand and that composed face, and she had never, not once, let him see it. Not because she was afraid of him, because the work required patience, and patience was what she had decided to give it, regardless of what the work cost her. He tried to imagine what it would take to do that, to know what you know, and to keep it contained for that length of time, in the service of something larger than the satisfaction of the moment, and he could not quite get there. It was not a quality he had ever needed to cultivate in himself, because he had never been required to. He sat with that for a while. The city behind the glass did not offer any commentary. It was simply there, doing what cities do, indifferent and enormous, and full of people whose names he did not know. He picked up his phone and stared at it and put it down. There was no one he wanted to call. There was no meeting to schedule, no decision to make, no action that would address the particular quality of what he was feeling, which was not exactly shame. He had felt shame before, and it was louder than this, but something quieter and more durable, something that was going to be with him for a while. The feeling of a man who has seen, for the first time, the size of a blind spot he has been carrying. He was still sitting there when June, his assistant, came to the door to ask if he needed anything, and he said no. "June, thank you. I'll be out in a few minutes." And she nodded and left, and he sat for a few more minutes that turned into 15. And then he got up and straightened his jacket and walked out of the conference room into the floor that was, he understood now, going to need to become a different floor. The restructuring took 4 months. Sam Birch was promoted to senior analyst, and then, 6 weeks after that, to team lead, which was fast by the building standards, but not by the standards of his actual output, which had always been there, waiting for a room that wanted it. He came to Francis's office on the day of the second promotion and stood in the doorway and said, "I want to say thank you. I want to say it properly." And Francis said, "The work was yours. I just made sure the room was the right size for it." He said, "You know that's not all it was." She said, "I know. Go do the job." The formal restructuring report was presented to the parent board in the autumn. It included a new internal framework for how junior staff were recruited, managed, and reviewed. Not a policy document in the abstract sense, but a living structure with named accountabilities and a regular review mechanism. It was called the Okafor Framework, which Francis had not requested and had tried, briefly, to redirect toward a more institutional name. The board had overruled her, which she found faintly ironic, and chose not to pursue. Edward Calder remained at Meridian. He remained in his role, in a division that was now organized differently around him, which required him to be different inside it. He was not always good at it. He was sometimes defensive, and sometimes slow, and sometimes fell back into the cadences of the person he had been for the 7 years before a woman with a Navy notebook had walked into his conference room and sat in his chair and told him to take a seat. But he was trying, which was more than he had been doing before, and Francis Okafor had been a careful enough observer of human nature to understand that trying, for a man like Edward Calder, was not a small or easy thing. It was, in fact, the hardest thing she had asked of him. She asked Miriam Park, who had stayed on with the catering team, and who had never once in 11 months of service broken a professional confidence, whether she would be willing to consult on the well-being component of the new framework, the part that addressed how support staff were treated, spoken to, managed, and protected. Miriam had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "I have a list." Francis said, "I thought you might." Miriam said, "It's long." Francis said, "Good. Bring it Thursday." On the afternoon of the framework's ratification by the parent board, Francis sat in her office, the one with 2 windows. The one she had chosen because it faced the street below and not the skyline above. And she was very quiet for a while. She was thinking about something her mother had said to her years ago, when she was 17 and had come home from a Saturday job at a hotel, where a manager had spoken to her in a way that still sat uneasily in the memory. Her mother had said, "There will always be rooms that try to tell you what you are. Your job is to keep knowing better. One day you'll be the one who decides what the room says." Her mother had died the previous spring. A long illness, managed with as much grace as her mother had managed everything. Francis had been at her bedside for the last 3 weeks, which was why she had requested a particular accommodation from the parent board during that period. Not a break in the assignment, just a remote working arrangement, early mornings and late evenings, which the board had granted without question, because Francis Okafor was not someone you questioned over a request like that once you understood who you were dealing with. She had never told anyone in the building. There had been no reason to. The work had continued. The notebook had continued. The coffee pots had been steady in her hand every morning, even in the weeks when they were the hardest thing she carried. There were things about this building that no organizational chart would ever show. There were things about the people who moved through its service corridors, and its executive kitchens, and its lobby, that the performance reviews, and the revenue projections, and the strategy alignment sessions could not contain. Frances had spent 11 months learning them, and she had written them into the framework, not with names attached, but with the weight they deserved. And the board had ratified them, and they were now part of how this building understood itself. One morning in December, 3 months after the ratification, Edward Calder came into the kitchen on 32 to refill his own coffee cup, a thing he had never done before in 7 years. Because his coffee had always come to him, and the concept of going to get it himself had never occurred to him as necessary. He was not performing. There was no audience. He came in, found the pot, poured his cup, and there was a young woman from the catering team there, starting her morning setup, who looked up when he came in with the expression people have when someone unexpected enters a space they consider theirs. He said, "Good morning." She said, carefully, "Good morning, Mr. Calder." He said, "I don't think I know your name." She said, "Adize." He said, "How long have you been on 32? She said, 7 months. He said, "Okay." He picked up his coffee. He paused at the door. He said, "The pastries on Tuesday are better than the ones on Thursday, just in case you were curious about what people actually notice." She stared at him. He left. She stood there for a moment and then laughed, not unkindly, but with the genuine surprise of someone who has just watched a thing happen that they were not expecting. Miriam Park, who had been in the back of the kitchen and had heard the whole exchange, came out and stood next to Adize and looked at the door through which Edward Calder had just left. She said, Adize said, "Was that?" Miriam said, "Yes." Adize said, "Is he always?" Miriam said, "No, he is not." She went back to her prep work. But she was smiling, in the particular way a person smiles when they have watched something they did not fully believe was possible actually happen, and the surprise of it is not smaller for being a small thing. Some things begin with a grand gesture. Some things begin with a man learning someone's name in a kitchen. Frances heard about it from Miriam on Thursday, the way Miriam reported most things, in 3 sentences, without editorializing, with the precision of someone who has spent 9 years understanding which details carry weight. Frances sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "Good." Miriam said, "You knew he could?" Frances said, "I didn't know. I thought it was possible." There's a difference. Outside her window, the city was beginning its December evening, the early dark, the lights coming up across the buildings, the particular coldness of the air that had come in overnight from the north and was sitting over the city like something patient. On a clear evening, you could see a long way from the 14th floor. Not the skyline. The streets, the actual city, the one that ran beneath the skyline at the level where people walked and worked and carried things and learned other people's names, or didn't. Frances looked at it for a while. Then she opened the notebook. She still kept it, still wrote in it, though the entries were different now, less observation and more intention, and she wrote a single line at the top of a clean page. She wrote it and looked at it and did not add anything to it, because it was already complete. It said, "A room does not decide what you are. You decide what the room becomes." She closed the notebook. She picked up her coat. She turned off the lamp. And if you have ever been in a room that looked at you and saw only what you were holding in your hands and not what you were carrying inside, if you have ever been called sweetheart when your name was worth a great deal more than that, and you kept your hand steady anyway, and you kept your spine straight anyway, and you kept going, and going, and going, Because you knew something the room didn't know yet, then you already understand what this story was really about, and why it matters, and why it will never stop mattering, for as long as there are buildings in this world that decide in advance who belongs at the head of the table. The answer, always, is the person who never needed the table to tell them.